Salut, bienvenue. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis très heureuse d'être ici aujourd'hui. J'aime Hackfest. J'aime la belle Provence. J'aime aussi l'opportunité de parler en français avec vous. And now I will speak in English. Okay. I'm really excited to talk to you about one of my very favorite subject areas, banking on insecurity. So first of all, who am I? Cheryl Biswas. I work in cybersecurity now. I am with a small firm, Secura Inc., who does offensive stuff. I was with KPMG before that. I have a lot of interests, as you can see. I have a poli-sci degree, so it's important to remember anything you learn, you can bring into the security community and use. I love to give talks, and I'm also a founding member of the Diana Initiative, where we promote women in security and diversity. Finally, online, I'm known as Encrypted. And last but not least, the views expressed here are my own, not those of my employer. So let's get started. A couple of years ago, when I was a total noob, I saw patterns repeating themselves, and while that might be good in knitting, it is not such a good thing for security. And bad behaviors lead to lax security. The basics, well, they weren't being done well if they were being done at all. And I found attitudes ranged from blissful ignorance to adamant denial. Again, history repeats itself, and that's not necessarily a good thing. You can make book on that. So we're seeing big data become bigger data. And IoT is taking over the world, right? But we are still not getting the basics right. The problem is we rely on what we know or what we think we know. We're living in a world of some pretty dangerous assumptions, and that's leading to some cracks in the framework of what run our daily lives. So what I want to point out is that information security, cybersecurity, these do not live in silos. These are integral to everything that we do. Now, we get that. Everybody else? Not so much. Let's talk about some blasts from the past. Who's familiar with Configure? How about everybody knows Stuxnet? Good bedtime reading. Who's familiar with the stories around Saudi Aramco? 2 words, wiper malware. Very bad stuff. And it made a resurgence this year. How about Heartbleed? Oh, geez, yeah. And who's still cleaning up after this one? Yes, wait. Okay, there are candies. Candies for all of you, because you've suffered so much. I know, and it's just like it keeps coming back. It never went away. Yeah. So we keep repeating mistakes. And the problem is, this is not like the movie Groundhog Day. We're not getting better at doing the same thing over and over. What we're doing is leaving windows of opportunity open. And when you do that, who needs backdoors, right? So the attackers are literally banking on our insecurity. Which brings, for me anyway, a few things to mind, and I'm going to share them with you. That what we need to say isn't being said. That's why I did this talk. I did it behind closed doors in Vegas, and I just had so many people coming up saying they have a lot to say, but they can't talk about it. But it's what we share with each other that's crucial. That information helps us spot patterns, do trends, identify things in the malware that link one group to another so that we can see their next move, their next pivot. So let's talk about Swift, baby. And we are going to. Or how about geopolitics and who's playing whom? Because there is a real art to the long game, and China and Putin are masters at it. That's playing out in the theater real right now. Because it isn't all about the money. Let's talk about what attackers do better than us. I've got 2 words for it: collaboration and communication. The fact is, these guys have learned how to work with each other because cybercrime is an extremely efficient business model. These guys share their information, work effectively. As defenders, we have to get it right all of the time. As attackers, they only have to get it right once. What we benefit from as a community, what we thrive at as a community, is the information that we share and teach each other, and that we need to communicate so that we're not all of us working in a silo, heads down, trying to find something that already exists. This will give us a leg up. It will save us time, and time is a luxury we don't have. So let's move into stories about SWIFT. Okay, so we assume that banks, especially SWIFT, right? If you know anything about SWIFT, and you're going to after this, take better care of our money than anybody. Okay, so what is SWIFT, other than a very important international organization with a couple 100+ members and a lot of money involved? It originated to facilitate transfer payments between nation states. And it was done to make it easier, more efficient, and faster. These are really important words in business, in bottom line, and in profit. We know that business is what drives us. We know that we serve the businesses we are part of. However, it does not mean security. So SWIFT sends payment orders between institutions, and it uses unique SWIFT codes. This is based on a relationship management application that runs over a bilateral key exchange. So essentially, it's about syntax, processes, and a turnkey solution for ease of use. When SWIFT talks about itself, it talks in terms of efficiency. This is what business understands as reliable. Now, we know that we're supposed to trust but verify, right? However, when we're being told we are supposed to trust an organization like SWIFT because it is the best at what it does, we do. And then there's this. Okay, so we've got availability levels, which are a proof of their security equipment. Okay, please tell me, anybody, does security equate with uptime? Is uptime equivalent to security? Anybody? There's chocolate on this. No. No? Oh, there is chocolate. Chocolate for the room, yes. Because security, I will throw another one over there. Security is not uptime. I'm sorry. Okay, so since I got to give that talk on SWIFT, and that was like a summer ago, and I built it as a fairy tale on banking security, I have been following a steady stream of attacks, building a knowledge base on it, looking at the trends that have been developing, and it really has not let up. So what I'm seeing here is so much more than a cash grab, and that's really important. What happened with SWIFT, the trusted messaging service, is a really important lesson for everybody who's in the financial industry, and then security as a whole. This story for me was always so much more about not the attackers trying to get $1 billion and only getting 81 million. What it was 3 questions. It was, who was behind those hackers? Why did they specifically target the Bank of Bangladesh? And who was desperate enough to digitally rob a bank? Okay, so this was from Bay Systems when they initially identified the attack, and it's really quite fascinating in terms of, I would call it the sophistication of the attack, the components that they knew how to leverage. You're working with what is essentially a closed system. and it was accessible to the members. However, we know that attackers lurk in the networks for as long as they need to, and they gather recon. They get in, and then they live there because we don't find them. We don't find them because we're not looking for them. This goes back to, let's get the basics right. We know this, and that is what they were making book on. So somebody figured out what the weak point in that money chain was for SWIFT. The daily transfer printouts. Paper printouts of the transfers. This is a highly sophisticated system, but they rely on paper transfers, paper printouts of the transfers every day. This is key because it's quite the story. Now, it came out in the news that it was all at the fault of a $10 switch. Okay, we all know server room terrors, right? Everybody has seen that server room of cables and stuff that should not be in there. And it's easy to point the finger of blame. But the fact is, I think that's held up as a reflection to all of us to learn from. It wasn't because of that $10 switch. It was because of everything around why there was a $10 switch in service. It was because of a printer. This printer, to be exact, and that's kind of the brilliance of the scheme. So a whole lot of checking and monitoring of files was going on. Not by SWIFT, not by the bank, by the attackers. The attackers were watching every single move, every single line of code, making sure they knew when that printer kicked in, what it needed, what it did. Why? Because the malware they wrote for this intercepted the confirmation SWIFT messages. So it read, it parsed, and then it converted those into PRT files, and then into the specific PCL language used by this model of printer. That's very exact. Somebody really did their homework. And then these temporary PRT files were submitted, and once they came through, they got overwritten with zeros and were effectively deleted, enabling the attackers to step in at that point, control the process, and walk away with the money. So there's a lot of speculation. There was a lot of speculation at that time about who done it. And I'll admit my trio was the obvious ones: China, Russia, North Korea. Now in this case, Russia and China really weren't good targets because they're too big to make this kind of noise, this kind of a power play globally. They knew they would suffer eternal condemnation. It wasn't in it for them, and it was only really $1 billion. These two nations did not need $1 billion badly enough to put themselves in the hot seat. However, North Korea is a different story. This is a nation, if you know anything about it, that is impoverished. It really is. It's sad, and the people there are starving because of the way the country is being run. Because their wild card of a leader will stop at nothing to get his nukes. This is a fact, and we now have watched it play out on Fox and CNN. It's real life. So how long did it take for it to become apparent it was the Lazarus Group at work in North Korea with a wrench? And with a wrench because in many parts of our world, coercion is how you get things done. And they needed something to get the initial access and then to cover their tracks. So my theory was that Lil' Kim wanted all of the same nuclear toys all the other cool kids had. But we know that good nukes cost money, right? And Kim had broken his piggy bank some while ago. The things we do for money. His nation was starving. So he had some very capable house guests, known as the Lazarus Group, living under his roof. Now, does anybody know the story of Lazarus, what that term means? In the Bible, it's about a guy who rose from the dead. So it's used to imply somebody who literally can rise up from the dead, and this is a hallmark of this group. They will do their acts, they will disappear, only to reappear again. They're ephemeral, and they have been impossible, really, to pinpoint to a specific entity or party. Very interesting. There have been DDoS attacks dating from 2009. You can see they're involved in a list of very interesting activities. And even this year, there was some wiping of master boot records going on because of them. They're able to make their work look like hacktivism. So that throws, a red herring in the works and harder to attribute. And as we know, attribution, unfortunately, is the hardest thing to do and one of those roadblocks that keeps us from moving forward. We can't move forward, and you can't pin the finger of blame until you are absolutely certain. Well, they've been active in sabotaging operations in a range of industries, not just financial. And a pretty wide swath of nations have been impacted. Now, North America is only just beginning to feel their talents. And is it me, or is it that we don't pay attention as much until it actually lands on North American soil? Anybody want to weigh in on that one? Does it have to actually land on our doorstep before we will take action? Like I said, time is a luxury we don't have. The Washington Post issued a really interesting article very recently analyzing what was happening in terms of the nuclear developments in North Korea, assessing Kim Jong as the type of leader and not an irrational leader, somebody with a game plan that we had underestimated or sidestepped because it looked too crazy. Basically, they said that if you deem Kim Jong-un to be irrational, you are implicitly underestimating him. And we might be doing that for a few other things as well. He's crazy, but he's crazy like a fox. And that's why attacks were being made on banks that the rest of the world really wasn't paying attention to. If it was Switzerland, If it was England, If it was the US, for sure. But go put it in some place in Southeast Asia that people don't really know about. There's not very much attention, and it's actually derision that gets pointed there. So, case in point, let me say this. It's not our world over there. Like I said, coercion is how things get done. This is a nation that doesn't have the resources to work with that we take for granted on a daily basis. They don't have the money, and they don't have the training, and they don't have the mindset to put in place the security practices needed to really secure a financial facility. So, if corruption and coercion are how things get done in the rest of the world, how do these get factored on a NIST spreadsheet in security audits? This is the heist by numbers, what had been recorded up to date. And then, very recently, Taiwan has weighed in with an attack on them. Now, the attackers went after about $60 million. So far, most of that has been gotten back. There's about 500,000 still unreturned. And they are absolutely, this time, attributing it to the Lazarus Group. So lessons. Let's do a swift recap. Now, this isn't the first time that a nation-state's handed over the dirty work to an independent contractor. You can bet that Russia's done that, as well as the United States and other major countries. But in what is essentially a win-win scenario, except of course for the Bank of Bangladesh, the attackers went after that cool billion, and save for what was a pesky spelling mistake on the transfer, which got rejected, they had to walk away with the 81 million. Here are the banks involved, and this third point, I'm going to ask you to remember this. We'll come back to it. I thought this was very telling. It's a wake-up call. For those just tuning in, yeah, it is true. Because when it comes to the games that nation-states play, well, global economic chaos, it's right up there. So let's talk about the shadow brokers. And you know that other shoe? It's going to drop. because you can count all of the cards, but that wild card is going to turn up, and when it does, nation-state exploits are now out there. The turtle blue, we know what happens. And the skitties have them, and they are playing with them. So I'm going to share a little post-Halloween horror story with you. Okay, chocolates. Chocolates. For those who did not get chocolate. Yes, yes. Oh, guys. Oh, I have a horrible pitching arm. Sorry. Okay, I promise later. Okay. Let's talk about what was in that treasure trove that the shadow brokers revealed as their Easter egg on Good Friday. Ars Technica said this, not me. So Swift was adamant at the time that they had not been hacked, or their code had not been hacked. Well, sorry, not sorry, because that Good Friday dump was full of stuff, including code for hacking banks that were part of the SWIFT network. In particular, banks in the Middle East. And these belonged to a cheaper offshoot of the SWIFT network known as service bureaus. And these act as they're like cloud services for banks, but they're less expensive because it costs money to pay money. And SWIFT is very pricey. Well, one of those was called EastNets. And remember, this is the United States, the NSA, their exploits. EastNets is one of 74 certified service bureaus within the SWIFT network. So they're all part of this trusted network until SWIFT says, oh, you're not as good as we are. And actually, they do that. I'm all for value, but I'm going to raise the question here. Was EastNets more easily targeted because it wasn't a premium SWIFT offering? I don't know if any of you know of Matt Swish, but he is a security researcher, a Microsoft MVP, and quite active on Twitter. He has some excellent accounts and a blog post, and I follow him for stuff, especially breaking news, and he did a really good takedown in terms of what was in the shadow broker's treasure trove and how it impacted the SWIFT network, especially those Middle Eastern banks. He said this: given the small number of these service bureaus, of which there are just 74, and that they have maybe one IP address, how easy would it be to compromise any, if not all, of these service bureaus? I will leave that one with you. Matt Swish is a go-to for me for many reasons. And I'll have some information on my very last slide if you want to look it up further. He provided some screenshots at the time of the dump and explanations about how the NSA had actually compromised SWIFT before North Korea was even in this game. So here you can see some of the findings that were in that trove. That's stuff that should never be available. These are compromised admin accounts. Sophisticated. These were multi-stage attacks that bypassed the Cisco ASA firewall appliances. So they exploited and they infected the Windows servers. And then they copied the Oracle databases of the numerous hosts that belong to SWIFT. Now, we know that Oracle has many bad days, right? We know that Windows is Windows. Nonetheless, this was not something that should have ever happened. And it is as bad as it sounds, because these service bureaus were part of what was considered to be a trusted network. Moreover, Matt, and I would agree with him on this one, likens it to Stuxnet in that this was that very rarest of occasions when a nation-state targeted another nation-state with a bunch of O-days. Yeah, that is very, very significant. It went after that nation-state's critical infrastructure with those O-days. And banks are critical infrastructure. Here's the list of targets that the NSA exploits were targeted at from as early as 2013 and that are now out there and being played with. So this is the equivalent of hacking all of the banks in the region without having to attack them individually. Right, This is very easy, too easy, and why we should be worried. Because this way you can access all of their transactions. Compromised. This is what it actually looked like when you run the exploits against, for example, the Palestinian bank. And over here, there's hard-coded passwords in those credentials that were lifted from the machine language from that treasure trove. And that's exploits for sale. So yeah, stuff happens, right? But this is what stuff happens looks like when it's global financial. Well, let's talk about attitudes. So this is one reason why I don't sleep well at night. I don't know, but maybe 1 in 5 bank executives being able to detect a breach, is that like pigs sniffing out truffles? This is actually a higher percentage than most children who believe in Santa Claus. And this one? Well, I'm sorry to say, but you know that if you cover your eyes, it does not make the bad stuff go away. Yeah, the struggle is real. And I have done audits, and I've met those who swear by their methods over best practices. And they manage our money. And these are the things I have heard over and over again by people who honestly should know better. I can't say more except that you find Adobe in places you never, ever should. I'm going to take you through a little tour of Carbanak, Dridex, and Lurk. Show of hands, who's familiar with these or has heard of them? Okay. These are some big daddies of financial malware and really good stories to tell. Essentially, the dead don't stay dead when it comes to this malware. Dridex died, but it resurfaced in Switzerland with some shiny new attack methods. And it's continued to evolve, and it's become more sophisticated than when it first emerged back in 2011. That was when it was known as Dridex. I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson because in history is context. We always need context. That's how we can build our patterns, connect the dots, and try to best anticipate the attacker's next move. Okay, so some hallmarks about Dridex. It receives dynamic configuration files. It uses web injections to steal money. It infects USB media, and it hides the CNC servers behind proxy layers. All smart moves, but they're very good at it. Now, it's not unusual to see exploits fade away, and then they come back. However, I don't think we're very good at expecting it. It seems like we get surprised every time this happens. For example, Zeus Sphinx. Is anybody familiar with Zeus as an attack vector? Right. So it came back August of 2016 and went after Brazilian banks. Interestingly enough, coinciding with the Olympics. There's always a reason. Well, that activity appeared to die down, and then, interestingly enough, IBM X-Force researchers discovered it at work, newer, refurbished, going after specific targets in terms of Canadian and Australian credit unions. Credit unions over banks. Why? Credit unions are smaller. Smaller means they don't have as much money, they don't have the resources or the mindset to really have the defenses in place. It makes them excellent low-hanging fruit, ripe for the picking. There were about 33 URLs that they identified. And interestingly enough, the attackers, and I guess this is part of it, and this is why we're looking for the patterns, they were using the same CNC servers that had been initially deployed back in 2016 for Zeus Citadel attacks and Ramnet. Lurk. Well, this one's from Russia with love. It was part of a cybercrime operation used in click fraud back around 2011 again. The Russians are really good at this stuff. So the gang went after about 29 million in customer accounts. And then they got a little greedy and they went after 39 million using false payment transfers. Oh, does that sound familiar? It's a la Swift. And those were blocked. So it got retooled and revamped to exploit weaknesses in bank security, of which there are many, and it was coupled with the Angler exploit. Now, there was an international effort amongst law organizations that actually succeeded in taking these guys down, and then the Angler exploit actually disappeared from view. One interesting point to note, and this is a score for the banks, they identified this attack and actually changed their defenses to recognize and meet it. So yes, it can be done. This is one case, but it's hope. Now, Cisco Talos has identified that the Lurk gang was also involved with the Neckers botnet. Has anybody heard of the Neckers botnet? Right, okay, good. And it's important because who's heard of Locky ransomware? It distributed Locky ransomware along with Dridex banking malware. Okay, and that brings us to Duku and fileless malware. Who here has heard of fileless malware or had to even deal with it? It is scary, freaking, fascinating stuff. And it is derived from the thing that brought me here, Stuxnet, which we've heard about, one of those offshoots. So Duku 2.0 was discovered by Kaspersky 6 months after it had been residing on their networks, their corporate networks. And this is because it lives in the memory of the computers. So it's very hard to trace anything that's memory resident. We understand how that works. It's terrible if you're trying to do forensics, and we need to do forensics in order to understand what went wrong. So when an infected computer gets rebooted, it actually changes the name, and you are looking for the wrong thing. It's already over here, given something else. Another interesting point about Duku or Duku 2.0 is that the calling card has to do with embedding PowerShell into the registry to download as an interpreter. And this has become a trend over this past year, something very interesting to note. This is new. Has anybody been following the reports? Have you heard of silence? So we all know the importance of doing recon, correct? Any mission, especially if you're on offensive security, you need to understand your target. The attackers are excellent at recon, and this gives them a leg up on us. Now, what's key is, while it looks like Carbanak, and it borrows from it, it is not Carbanak. It's already had about 10 different banks that's attacked, and it's still ongoing. It utilizes spear phishing emails to download and execute the droppers. There's a backdoor which sends the system information, then malicious code is delivered, affected, creds are stolen, everybody cries, and it starts the screen's recording. So yes, everything that's attached to the network that is a screen is potentially activated to record what the bank employees are doing. And this is how you gain initial access. Very important point. Does anybody have a guess as to what this map is about? There's chocolate. I will throw you a chocolate just because. Okay, what have I been talking about? Big word, starts with C. Anybody? Okay. Carbanak. Carbanak. Yes. So, there's a song that goes, "Everything old is new again," and this is a case for Carbanak. In order to really understand attackers, what we need to understand is history for the point of context to really appreciate their pivots. And finding context within their past pursuits, we can get a sense of where they're headed to next. We need to be able to do that. Now, we've been watching Carbanak pivot from banking into hospitality and retail. It's gone after chimichangas. It's gone after our favorite fast food places. Damn them. But yes, because in this industry, which has far less money to spend on securing itself, low-hanging fruit is always in season. Yes, and we know that cybercrime is based on efficiency. It is the perfect business model. But Carbanak is too established within the financial realm to forever leave it. So they have been doing, retooling themselves. And what they have done is upgrade to exploit some of our favorite tools. Who here does offensive security? Pen testing. So you know things like Metasploit, Meterpreter, Veil, and PowerShell. Things that we use for the powers of good, they now use for the powers of evil. And the other thing is that this is not signature-based malware. So I'm sorry, no, Virginia, you cannot use VirusTotal. Kaspersky, Symantec, McAfee, and God knows what else, Cylance. They are not going to pick these things up anymore. We can't rely on it like we used to. So we have to evolve with these new attacks. If we go looking using these, we are not going to find them. And honest to God, they are in there. So I'm going to walk you through what is essentially the pivot of Carbanak and the Operation Grand Mars. Motive? Money, control, and total ownership, right? Collaboration. They do it better than we do. Spider Labs reports analyzed this and talked about how several groups came together. So that's different signatures. And you would only have known this if you were tracking the different signatures of these groups and recognized those footprints in the butter. Now, there's still validity in signature-based identification if we're actively monitoring it, know what to look for, and what it's relevant to. That's a lot of work, though. And are we going to get the backing from the people who will pay for it? I don't know. We have to be able to prove the validity of it. Another point is being able to share threat intelligence, which, again, who here is a proponent of sharing threat intelligence? Who here thinks it's not such a great idea? No? Share knowledge. Who here has a gag order by their company that they're not allowed to say what they think? I'm so sorry. Here, have a chocolate. Okay. So yes, you could be warned if you've got the monitoring set up on your systems to track for specific signatures. Number 3, we know that this is the most common attack vector. This is how they get in. Well, how far would you be willing to go to stop them at this step? Does anybody here listen to the podcast Breaking Down Security with Brian Brake? All right. He had a guest on recently. I love a lot of podcasts. This is one of them. Michael Goff is an expert on ransomware. He's given some really good talks. And one of them was about how he analyzed the human factor. Now, we all know that the human condition is our biggest challenge. How the hell do we keep people from clicking on things, right? That's it. That's the essence of phishing. Michael Goff said, well, maybe we don't. Maybe we just go one step above the humans, the way you put a baby gate up across stairs, and we make it so that it doesn't matter how many times they click, nothing happens. So he did an experiment over the course of a year, and he went into their systems and enabled their systems to not recognize that double click. Now, they didn't lose business. It was probably very different for people. People don't like change, and it was probably slower or harder. But the fact is it went from like a ridiculous percentage of 60% down to 2% within a year, because the attackers realized, and they were measuring their statistics, that nothing was getting through. They stopped. They stopped. They found somebody else to bother. they moved on. I would recommend you listen to this podcast if you would like to see how you might implement out-of-the-box thinking, because that's what's going to do it. And I thought it was fascinating. Moving on, they passed the hash for privilege escalation. We're familiar with that step. Persistence. We're familiar with that part. Via scheduled tasks. So if you're not really looking at things, if you're just expecting to see things, you're going to miss this. And then the attackers gained their domain and admin in CNC points, both in Europe as well as the US. Then they leveraged cloud services, enterprise access. Who here has to deal with the joy of cloud services on a daily basis? How happy does that make you in your job? Who here understands the concept of shadow IT? Exactly. So that if you are thinking you have 60 cloud services, how many do you really have? It's an exponential number. You've got 600. Woo! Yes, that is what's going on. And once, it's like Pandora's freaking box. Once it's out there, you cannot take it back. You cannot restrict it. It exists, and you have to live with it. So the attackers built this malicious code, and it utilized the memory resident PowerShell, then JavaScript, VBS, right? So it's taking some tools that we all know and are familiar with and turning them to evil. We've seen like TV movies about people who've got red eyes glowing. It's kind of like that. Metasploit, PowerShell, Veil. These are frigging powerful programs. When you are a pen tester, they are really good at what they do. So in the hands of somebody that you do not trust, it's a bad, bad thing. There was a remote backdoor for data exfiltration. And then, I hate this part, valid Komodo certificates for the win. We've seen over the past several years what happens with trusted certificates, what happens to companies that don't do a good job managing their trusted certificates. You cannot really trust trusted certificates is what I'm trying to say. And this is now part of a systematic series of attacks against hospitality. But not just hospitality. This is going into retail, point of sales machines. How many terminals are in one Walmart? How many Walmarts are out there? How many grocery stores are out there? And e-commerce. So the target base is massive. And if you just do the numbers, a little bit of money over a lot of people adds up fast. Attackers are smart with math. And then finally, they changed up the command and control servers. So they'd put one down and take one up again to throw people off the scent. Tricky, but it worked. Well, we live by this saying, don't we? But it doesn't always play out. So coming back to my litany on trusted certificates being not so trustworthy, does anybody have another example of untrustworthy trusted certificates they want to throw my way? What was that? Thank you. Very good. Come up and get a chocolate when we're done. Okay. And there's been more. We have systems in place with breaks that we cannot fix. This is a key example. And then the long game. Patience, perseverance, persistence. They get in there and they have a long-range plan. Key would be China and Russia. They're really, really good at this. And the problem is once we realize what's going on, we're already pawns in the game. It's already playing out, and that has become our reality. I'm going to take you now on a world tour of cybersecurity as I see it. The intersection of global security and information security. This is the man of the hour, isn't it? Holy crow. So, does he who has all of the money make all of the rules? Well, $200 billion says that he thinks so. And resources and staging grounds matter. So, back in August of this year, the banks in the Ukraine braced for yet another attack. If you're not familiar with what's going on with the Ukraine, essentially, Putin is old school KGB. He would like Russia to become the Soviet Union once again and pull back all of the pieces that left it. And one of those pieces for him is the Ukraine. And he has been going after that like a dog with a bone since 2015. So, I likened it to Putin's petri dish. His cyber experiments in the Ukraine are netting results, but what's he going to actually leverage those results against in terms of a bigger fish, a bigger quarry? And this was on the heels of the Petya, not Petya outbreaks. Let's do a little walk through geopolitics and global finance. China's an interesting case in point. It's been steadily acquiring pieces of Africa and using that for its staging ground. We hear about it, we read about it in the news, but we really don't link the dots. Africa is volatile, and for them, China is just one in a succession of colonial takeovers that have left that continent nothing more than warring factions. Regardless, it offers China geography and resources, which that nation needs and will put to very good use. North Korea, well, we have been watching the news reports. It's small, but it's volatile and it's unpredictable, and it is driven by the desire of its leader to have nuclear capability and be the top, the kingpin of that. He has to be in with all of the other players, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. It costs money. Kim has stablesfuls of hackers at his disposal, at his service. And as well, he's only too willing to take on the dirty work of drugs, trafficking, and things that we don't even really want to think about. The rest of the world won't touch, but he will do this to fund his habits. And now I've got an interesting story to share. I'm going to use the Polish bank attacks from earlier this year, and I'm going to ask, was anybody or has anybody followed that story from about the beginning of February this year? Attacks on the Polish banks. Anybody else? It's a good story. Okay. So a few banks in a small country will teach all of us an important security lesson. There were a series of targeted malware attacks against Polish banks. Now, again, why Poland? This is like a little country. It minds its own business. It's actually very good in terms of security and bank security and research. And they discovered they were being hit. And believe me, I was watching, because I have a bad Twitter habit, them crying out for attention and assistance when these attacks were going on. And they were saying, we're really good, and what's happening? And is anybody else seeing this? And the silence was deafening. So the attackers went after the data and not the money. So that's interesting. And they left a very interesting trail of traffic in terms of exotic locations and encrypted executables that nobody had ever seen before. That's a rarity in our community, really, to see unusual, like malware that nobody can say where this came from. There are a lot of very smart minds out there. They were coming up empty on this one. I was following the Twitter. It was 2 a.m. Okay. And there were unauthorized files on key machines within the networks. So nothing really happened until a group of commercial banks said, hey, wait, we've been attacked. And then people started paying a whole lot of attention. they realized there was a problem. They followed the trail, and it led to a poisoned well. It was a web server within the regulatory body of Poland's financial sector. The regulatory body was issuing the crap. Now, do you want to know what the interesting part is? Ta-da! It's the Lazarus Group again. Holy crap. These guys get around. And we still don't know exactly who they are. So according to Symantec, this is a threat actor behind about targeted financial attacks within 31 other countries from October 2016. The Polish website that was used to target the Polish banks was delivering a particular strain of malware that has since been identified to be part of the toolkit known to belong to the Lazarus Group. So there's 3 strains, and I'll tell you the names of them if you want to make notes. Backdoor Fimless B, and Backdoor Contopi. But you can read more about it. The fact is, at the time it was happening, nobody had the same information to connect the dots. Did you hear that other shoe drop? Okay, so this is what it looks like. It's not just Poland that was being targeted. There were 150 different IP addresses, and you can see there were banks and institutions, Mexico, Brazil, Great Britain. Nobody's exempt from this, but it was Poland that was kind of like a red herring, so they would go after some other targets, possibly more lucrative targets. Bad Cyber was one of the earliest blogs from a local guy in Poland trying to make sense of what was going on and asking, why is nobody listening? Because we got a problem here. And he said, we need collaboration. We need to share this threat information because we need to be able to identify it and put the pieces together. So I'm going to share something that I've noted that is trending, and I'm going to ask if anybody else is familiar with it. Web application compromise. How many people would say they've noticed a definite trend in this in terms of becoming a problem, specifically targeting the financial sector? Well, what's interesting is Dark Reading just recently issued a piece on it. And I know that I heard something on the podcast and read the Verizon data breach report earlier this year, again, that identified this as a growing trend, much more of a threat to the financial sector, and actually eclipsing, if it's possible, the human factor as a threat in breaches. I'm going to move on now to Southeast Asia. Again, another territory over and above Bank of Bangladesh bank heist. ATM jackpotting. Who has heard of ATM jackpotting? It's a pretty cool technique. And the machine's literally spewing the money out at you. It's a cash grab, but it's a smart one. And this was it was called the Cobalt Siege. It covers a very wide swath. It is not limited to just a few countries. We've got United Kingdom, Spain, Romania, Netherlands, Malaysia, and much of Eastern Europe. And it's probably landed on the Americas. It's been dubbed as the new model of organized crime because it really works. And the FBI has issued warnings to US banks this past summer because of it. Then there were some DDoS attacks, extortion attempts on several banks in South Vietnam by a group known as the Armada Collective. You may have heard of them. They're known for issuing empty threats. Big threats, nothing happens. I'm just going to say this. Where there's smoke, there will be fire. I wouldn't call them empty for long. And then there is Brazil. I call it the dark horse because it's rather interesting. It is the epicenter of where banking malware is formed. It's mostly self-contained, but it has a thriving industry in financial cybercrime. This is a country where corruption is so entrenched, they openly sell their crime wares on social media, like Facebook is where you brag about the exploit you've built and how much it is for sale. Not only that, they offer training courses. For a few $100, you can get a really good education in how to set up yourself in your own little crime malware shop. And it's a booming business. Last but not least, and I'll call this a game changer for good reason. We all know that CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. This got turned on its head this past year by NotPetya, when availability, because of ransomware, has become the most serious issue we are contending with. And availability isn't just something that affects business, it affects hospitals, it affects banks. If we can't get our cash, if we can't hook up to a life support system, if we can't heat our homes and it's 30 below, yeah, it really matters. So what about the fact that the latest pivot in ransomware was not about the money? It was never about the money. It wasn't designed to get money. It was all about attacking availability. So money can't buy happiness. But what if it cannot buy the essential services that we all rely on? Ukraine wasn't banking on that. Neither are we. And this was a power play. So integrity matters when you need to restore your data and your systems. We know this is a problem. DRC, business continuity, people really don't have plans in place, and if they do, they haven't necessarily tested them. We have cloud services, but have we actually checked to see how the data syncs up? I'm asking this because I have a couple of friends who guard and test the mainframes, who have worked in finance for 25 years, who are tough guys and actually very scared about what they find on an ongoing basis. We are not prepared for when we go to restore after what is a catastrophic event and the data doesn't sync up because somebody has been nimbly moving through and exfiltrating one bit at a time. And that's all it takes. So that's pretty much it for me. Are there any questions, comments you would like to share? I know, I've kind of overwhelmed you, or maybe it's the chocolate. All right, well, to sum it up, yes?
So I'm a little bit curious about DDoS. So on the one hand, you mentioned that they don't quite have the tools. So I don't know how much credit for that. They don't quite have the tools, but they need the money to send those starting. And on the other hand, they have these hackers who go and stuff. So I find that a little bit interesting.
It is interesting. It's the case of the terrible parent. The parent that will buy themselves a pair of Louboutins or a lovely Louis Vuitton handbag, but their kids are starving. It's exactly that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't even think the hackers are making that much money. They're scared, and at least they have a roof over their head and food on their tables like other people don't. Remember, Kim Jong had his brother killed. So behaviors and attitudes are key. Understanding. Oh, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So you asked us why, if we know why there is not so much information sharing between organizations with respect to threats. So in the financial industry, is there a sort of callous competitive consideration from financial institutions that would prompt them to not share details about threats? For instance, if they've been hit by a certain threat, they manage to push it back, but then they keep it for themselves and hope to God that their competitors get real bad by it.
There is, certainly I can speak to Canada, a lot of companies, finance as well, have been living under the, they keep the secret to themselves. It's a dirty little secret. We now have a new data breach law coming in effect that they have to disclose when something happens. This is going to be a really big awakening call for everybody. Because no, you don't want to say I got breached. You don't want to say this was a problem. You don't want to show your weaknesses. Also, from a competitive advantage and profit building, you don't want to share how you do business, because you want to stay ahead of the pack. And that's that mentality that's enforcing behaviors. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's not my personal opinion. It's gleaned from a lot of research and looking at what people are saying and connecting the dots and being able to say, okay, this keeps coming up. When something keeps coming up, we've really got an issue, and it's being reinforced by numerous voices. However, we haven't recognized it because it's not as big. It doesn't trump, it hasn't until now trumped Trump, for example. And it's like squirrel, right? Squirrel, squirrel, squirrel. We're attracted to the moment. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah.
So you were mentioning at one point how that organization turned off its overhead function and it sort of like elicited a sort of deterrent strategy for the attackers. My question though is, I can see obviously how it would work in an organization, but if we're talking in terms of like security of the nation state, what are the implications of, let's say, passing around that sort of target? You know, if one, let's say, corporation or organization is now destroying it, then they're just going to go to something else, which may be in the same state and potentially even more vulnerable.
Yeah. So the sad truth about nation states is they all know what each other is doing. They are in league. They spy on each other. Five Eyes. They spy on each other. They're going to throw somebody else under the bus when they have to save themselves. When there's a bully amongst the ranks, nobody questioned or stood up to Putin because they weren't willing to take the hit, and they wouldn't unite as a collective because the risk was too high. It's much harder to do this at nation-state level. Okay. I will share with you the last slide, and I want to say thank you. Thank you very, very much. There's Candy.